New York City, January 31st, 1891. Winter had settled over Manhattan, and inside a boarding school on West 40th Street, 19-year-old Helen Potts was preparing for what should have been an ordinary Saturday night. 3 of the young women who shared her room were going to a concert, but Helen decided not to join them. She suffered periodically from headaches, and that evening she preferred to remain behind. Earlier, she had been given medicine for those headaches by someone she trusted completely, a young medical student named Carlyle Harris. The medicine came in small capsules. There had originally been 6. Helen had already taken 3, and only one of the 4 given to her remained. If you're enjoying these historical cases, please like the video and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. That afternoon, Helen had shown the last capsule to her mother and complained that the medicine made her feel unpleasant. She disliked taking it so much that she considered throwing the final capsule out of the window and simply telling the school principal she had swallowed it. Her mother discouraged her. Quinine could make a person feel miserable, Mrs. Potts reasoned. Perhaps Helen simply needed to finish the treatment. So later that evening, Helen took the final capsule and at around 10 o'clock went to bed. When her roommates returned from their concert at approximately 10:30, they awakened her. Helen was able to speak clearly, but something was wrong. She complained of numbness and said that swallowing felt difficult. There was a choking sensation in her throat. Yet there was something strangely contradictory about her mood. Helen told the girls that she had been having such lovely dreams. Within a short time, those pleasant sensations disappeared. Her roommates were awakened again by Helen moaning. One of the girls rubbed her head, attempting to comfort her, but Helen said she could not feel it. Then her breathing became heavy. The principal of the school, Miss Day, was summoned around midnight. By then, Helen could no longer move voluntarily, and soon afterward she became unconscious. The school physician, Dr. Fowler, arrived within minutes. What he saw immediately concerned him. Helen was extremely pale and cold. Her skin was covered with perspiration. Her breathing had slowed to approximately 2 respirations a minute, and her pupils were contracted almost to points. Dr. Fowler had spent more than 35 years practicing medicine, and to him the pattern was alarming. It resembled severe opiate poisoning. Dr. Fowler was soon joined by Dr. Boehner, and later by another physician, Dr. Kerr. For hours, the doctors tried almost everything available to them in 1891. They maintained artificial respiration by moving Helen's arms. They administered stimulants including caffeine, atropine, digitalis, and whiskey. Black coffee was used. Electricity and oxygen were tried. For a brief period, after several hours of work, Helen's breathing improved, but then it slowed again. The doctors considered using a stomach pump, though her respiration was already so weak that they feared the procedure itself might prove dangerous. Morning arrived, but Helen continued to fade. At approximately 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, February 1st, she died. She had appeared healthy the evening before. Now the physicians had to explain how a 19-year-old woman could go from talking about pleasant dreams to complete unconsciousness and death in the space of a single night. Inside Helen's room, Dr. Fowler found something that immediately became important: an empty medicine box. The label carried instructions to take 1 capsule before retiring and bore the initials CWH, followed by the word student. The initials belonged to Carlyle Wentworth Harris. He was 22 years old and studying medicine at New York's College of Physicians and Surgeons. To almost everyone at the school, Harris was simply a young man who had been paying attention to Helen. Only a very small number of people knew the truth. Carlyle Harris was not Helen Potts' boyfriend. He was her husband. Dr. Fowler sent for Harris before Helen died. When Harris arrived, Fowler questioned him about the capsules. Harris explained that he had written a prescription containing 25 grains of sulfate of quinine and 1 grain of sulfate of morphine, divided into 6 capsules. That meant every capsule, if properly prepared, should contain slightly more than 4 grains of quinine and only 1/6 of a grain of morphine. It was not enough, Fowler believed, to explain the condition of the young woman lying unconscious before him. The doctor told Harris that even one full grain of morphine should not normally produce a case as profound as this one. Perhaps, he suggested, the pharmacist had made a mistake. Maybe the quantities had somehow been reversed. Fowler instructed Harris to return to the pharmacy immediately and investigate. Harris left. A short time later he returned and said there had been no mistake. The medicine, he claimed, Ed had been compounded exactly according to his prescription. There was only one problem. Evidence presented later showed that Harris had not actually visited the pharmacy at that time. He would not go there until after Helen was dead. The physicians also noticed something about his behavior. The New York Court of Appeals would later describe him as remarkably composed under the circumstances. After Helen died, Harris reportedly exclaimed, "My God, what will become of me?" He repeatedly asked whether he might be held responsible. And although Helen was secretly his wife, Harris told the physicians, and eventually the coroner, that he was merely her friend. To understand why a married man would conceal his relationship with his dead wife, the investigation had to return to the summer of 1889. Helen Potts and Carlyle Harris met at Ocean Grove, New Jersey. Helen was 18 years old. Harris was a medical student. When Helen's family later spent the winter in New York, the acquaintance continued. Harris visited, and a courtship developed. Helen's mother became increasingly uncomfortable with the relationship and considered her daughter too young to marry. Then, on February 8, 1890, Harris obtained permission to take Helen into the city to see the New York Stock Exchange. That was not where they went. Instead, the two appeared before an alderman and were married. They did not use their full legal names. Carlyle became Charles Harris. Helen became Helen Nielsen. Then they returned to their ordinary lives without publicly announcing what they had done. To Helen, however, the ceremony represented something very real. Whatever the world believed, she was now married. To Harris, secrecy appeared to remain essential, and almost immediately, according to Helen's mother, his behavior began to change. By May, when the Potts family returned to Ocean Grove, Harris's attention toward Helen had noticeably declined. He visited less frequently, his manner toward her altered, and Helen became distressed by the change. Only a few months had passed since the marriage. In June, Helen's friend Miss Schofield came to visit. Helen insisted that Harris finally tell someone about their marriage. He did. But when Miss Schofield suggested that Helen's mother also needed to know, Harris reacted angrily. According to testimony later reviewed by New York's highest court, Harris said that public knowledge of the marriage would destroy his prospects. Miss Schofield also testified that he made troubling remarks about wishing himself free of the situation. At approximately the same period, another crisis emerged. Helen was pregnant. Evidence later introduced at trial showed that Harris attempted to end the pregnancy himself. Helen became seriously ill and eventually traveled to Scranton, Pennsylvania, where her uncle, physician Dr. Treverton, treated her. She required another medical procedure and fortunately recovered physically. But the episode made continued secrecy increasingly difficult. Her mother eventually learned both about the pregnancy and about the hidden marriage. For Harris, the secret he had protected for months was beginning to collapse. There was more. Dr. Treverton later testified about conversations he had with Harris during this period. According to Treverton, Harris boasted of previous relationships with women and claimed he had gone through secret marriage ceremonies before. Another witness, a man named Oliver, gave similar testimony. These were allegations presented by witnesses, not separately documented marriages proved by certificates in court, but legally they mattered. If Harris had already entered another valid marriage, the discovery of his marriage to Helen could place him in serious difficulty. Prosecutors would later argue that this gave him a powerful reason to keep Helen's marriage hidden. Another incident from September 1890 became part of the evidence against him. While staying at a hotel in Canandaigua, New York, Harris was seen with another young woman. A witness named Latham testified that he overheard Harris making a disturbing remark, involving a hypothetical wealthy husband being removed with a pill. The defense challenged the meaning and significance of this testimony, but to prosecutors, a pattern was developing. Again and again, when Harris felt trapped by relationships or obligations, witnesses described him speaking about escape. By then, Helen's mother knew the truth. Mrs. Potts did not immediately expose Harris. Instead, she tried to resolve the situation privately. Harris obtained another copy of the marriage record and signed an affidavit confirming that the ceremony conducted under assumed names had genuinely been between himself and Helen. He assured Mrs. Potts that the marriage was legal, but he remained deeply opposed to making it public. He told her he had not even informed his own family. When Mrs. Potts demanded a second ceremony before a minister, Harris persuaded her to delay. He also suggested sending Helen to Miss Comstock's boarding school in Manhattan. There, he said, she could receive the education and social preparation appropriate for the life they would eventually share. Mrs. Potts agreed. In December 1890, Helen entered the school, and Harris was permitted to visit her as a friend of the family. For Helen, it must have appeared that the secrecy finally had an end point. But in January, Harris attempted to postpone the matter again. He proposed delaying any public marriage for another 2 years. Mrs. Potts refused. Around January 18th or 19th, she wrote to him forcefully. Helen had already spent too long as an unacknowledged wife. The circumstances surrounding her illness in Scranton had attracted questions. Mrs. Potts demanded that Harris keep his promise. On February 8th, 1891, the first anniversary of the secret ceremony, he was to marry Helen before a minister and provide Mrs. Potts with the certificate. Harris answered that he would comply if another means of satisfying her concerns could not be found. The following day, January the 20th, he visited McIntyre & Sons, a pharmacy in New York City. There, he ordered the 6 capsules. The details of that pharmacy visit later became crucial. Harris first asked for another medication to be prepared. When told it would require me time, he said. He could not wait. He then presented the prescription for quinine and morphine. That could be prepared within minutes, so Harris stayed. Because morphine was involved, the pharmacist used particular care. One employee measured the drug, and another checked the quantity. 25 grains of quinine, 1 grain of morphine, 6 capsules. Each ordinary capsule therefore contained 1/6 of a grain of morphine. The prosecution would later emphasize this careful preparation because it greatly reduced the likelihood that a pharmacy mistake had accidentally produced a dangerous capsule. Harris took all 6 capsules from the shop, but he did not immediately deliver them to Helen. He retained them overnight. The next day, January 21st, he visited Miss Comstock's school and gave Helen only 4. He kept 2 for himself. Almost immediately afterward, Harris left New York for Old Point Comfort, Virginia, where he remained for approximately a week. While he was away, Helen wrote that the medicine did not help her and actually made her feel worse. Harris advised her to continue taking it. By the time he returned, Helen had swallowed 3 of the 4 capsules. Nothing fatal had happened. Then came Saturday, January 31st. That day, Helen, her mother, and Harris were together at the school. Helen appeared healthy, cheerful, and bright. Later, alone with her mother in her bedroom, she showed Mrs. Potts the medicine box. 1 capsule remained. Helen did not want it. Her mother, unaware of what was about to happen, persuaded her to finish the treatment. That evening, Helen swallowed the 4th capsule. Within hours, she was in a profound coma. By the following morning, she was dead. For prosecutors, the sequence suggested something chillingly simple. The pharmacy had produced 6 normal capsules. Harris had possessed them privately between January the 20th and January 21st. He then gave Helen 4, but retained 2. The prosecution's theory was that during the period when the capsules were in his possession, Harris opened one of the 4 intended for Helen and substituted a much larger quantity of morphine. The placement of that altered capsule among the 4 meant he could not know exactly when Helen would receive it, but eventually she would. The 2 capsules Harris kept would remain available for analysis, and they would contain exactly the harmless quantity the prescription called for. If questions arose, Harris would possess his own evidence that the medicine had been prepared correctly. There was another detail. During late December and early January, students at Harris's medical college had attended lectures concerning opium and its effects. Morphine had been passed among the students in wide-mouthed containers, and according to testimony, students were permitted to handle it. The prosecution could not prove that Harris took morphine from one of those containers. No witness saw him do so, but it established opportunity. He understood the substance, he had recently studied its effects, and he had possible access to it. The prosecution's theory did not require pharmacists to make a mistake. It required only that one capsule be altered after it left the pharmacy. Initially, however, there was no murder prosecution. The investigation had been handled badly, and Helen's mother contributed to the confusion. When the possibility of an autopsy arose, Mrs. Potts falsely claimed that her daughter had suffered from heart trouble. She later admitted why. She wanted to remove Helen's body from the school quickly and take her home to New Jersey. A public investigation threatened to expose the secret marriage and everything surrounding it. Even after Harris told her the death appeared to involve morphine, Mrs. Potts remained deeply afraid of the scandal that would follow. The coroner's office then compounded the problem. Important material was mishandled. The pillbox disappeared. There was no immediate autopsy. The capsule analysis was poorly managed, and the transcript of testimony from the coroner's proceedings could not be found. Assistant District Attorney Vernon M. Davis examined what remained and concluded that the case was too damaged to prosecute effectively. For a time, it appeared that Helen Potts's death might end there. But the newspapers did not let the case disappear. Reporters continued digging into the secret marriage and Helen's illness in Scranton. Affidavits from Mrs. Potts and Dr. Treverton reached the district attorney's office, and copies eventually reached reporters at the New York Evening World. On March 21, 1891, the newspaper published a major investigation into Harris. The World later claimed that its reporting had essentially forced the authorities into action. That was exaggerated, but newspaper pressure unquestionably helped keep the case alive. This was Gilded Age New York, where newspapers competed fiercely for circulation and criminal trials could dominate entire editions. The Harris case contained almost everything editors knew would attract readers: a young woman at an elite school, a secret marriage, medical science, hidden relationships, mysterious medicine, and a suspected crime without an eyewitness. Behind the sensationalism, however, investigators finally did something that should have happened at the beginning. Helen's body was examined. Approximately 55 days after her death, an autopsy was performed. The body was reportedly well preserved because it had been embalmed and placed in a dry brick vault. The examination found no significant disease of the heart. Nor was there evidence of the kidney disease that would later become part of the defense theory. The brain showed congestion, a finding the prosecution's physicians considered consistent with opiate poisoning. Then came the chemical analysis. Morphine was detected in material taken from Helen's stomach and tissues. Quinine was not detected. That mattered because Harris's prescription contained far more quinine than morphine. Experts testified that quinine was at least as chemically stable as morphine and should have been detectable if it had been present in comparable proportion. There was another important point. Helen had survived for roughly 12 hours after becoming seriously ill. Morphine is absorbed relatively quickly. The fact that investigators could still detect morphine in the stomach after that length of time suggested, in the prosecution's view, that the original Q quantity had been substantial. Physicians testifying for the state estimated that several grains would have been required to produce the condition they observed. The 2 capsules retained by Harris, meanwhile, contained the correct amount. So had the pharmacy made a mistake. The prosecution argued that it had not. 3 capsules taken earlier had not killed Helen. The 2 retained by Harris were normal. Only the final capsule produced the catastrophic reaction. That left 1 capsule unaccounted for, the capsule that no longer existed. By May 1891, Harris was formally facing a charge of first-degree murder. His trial began the following January before Recorder Frederick Smith in New York's Court of General Sessions. The prosecution included Francis L. Wellman and Charles E. Sims, Jr. Among Harris's trial attorneys were John A. Taylor, Charles E. Davison, and a young William Travers Jerome. Years later, Jerome would become famous as the prosecutor in another of New York's great sensational trials, the killing of architect Stanford White by Harry Thor. But in 1892, the case consuming New York was Helen Potts. On March 21, 1891, the newspaper published a major investigation into Harris. The World later claimed that its reporting had essentially forced the authorities into action. That was exaggerated, but newspaper pressure unquestionably helped keep the case alive. This was Gilded Age New York, where newspapers competed fiercely for circulation and criminal trials could dominate entire editions. The Harris case contained almost everything editors knew would attract readers: a young woman at an elite school, a secret marriage, medical science, hidden relationships, mysterious medicine, and a suspected crime without an eyewitness. Behind the sensationalism, however, investigators finally did something that should have happened at the beginning. Helen's body was examined. Approximately 55 days after her death, an autopsy was performed. The body was reportedly well preserved because it had been embalmed and placed in a dry brick vault. The examination found no significant disease of the heart. Nor was there evidence of the kidney disease that would later become part of the defense theory. The brain showed congestion, a finding the prosecution's physicians considered consistent with opiate poisoning. Then came the chemical analysis. Morphine was detected in material taken from Helen's stomach and tissues. Quinine was not detected. That mattered because Harris's prescription contained far more quinine than morphine. Experts testified that quinine was at least as chemically stable as morphine and should have been detectable if it had been present in comparable proportion. There was another important point. Helen had survived for roughly 12 hours after becoming seriously ill. Morphine is absorbed relatively quickly. The fact that investigators could still detect morphine in the stomach after that length of time suggested, in the prosecution's view, that the original Q entity had been substantial. Physicians testifying for the state estimated that several grains would have been required to produce the condition they observed. The 2 capsules retained by Harris, meanwhile, contained the correct amount. So had the pharmacy made a mistake? The prosecution argued that it had not. 3 capsules taken earlier had not killed Helen. The 2 retained by Harris were normal. Only the final capsule produced the catastrophic reaction. That left 1 capsule unaccounted for, the capsule that no longer existed. By May 1891, Harris was formally facing a charge of first-degree murder. His trial began the following January before Recorder Frederick Smith in New York's Court of General Sessions. The prosecution included Francis L. Wellman and Charles E. Sims, Jr. Among Harris's trial attorneys were John A. Taylor, Charles E. Davison, and a young William Travers Jerome. Years later, Jerome would become famous as the prosecutor in another of New York's great sensational trials, the killing of architect Stanford White by Harry Thor. But in 1892, the case consuming New York was Helen Potts. Despite the enormous amount of testimony, the legal problem was remarkably simple. No one had seen Harris tamper with a capsule. No one had seen him obtain an additional quantity of morphine. The capsule that supposedly contained the dangerous dose no longer existed. The case was circumstantial from beginning to end. The prosecution, therefore, had to construct a chain: motive, opportunity, medical knowledge, possession of the capsules, Helen's symptoms, chemical evidence, and Harris's conduct before and after her death. The defense attacked the weakest point in that chain: the medicine itself. Could the prosecution really prove that Helen died from a deliberately excessive dose of morphine? Defense experts proposed other explanations, including uremic poisoning associated with kidney problems and a possible hemorrhage in part of the brain. They also explored the possibility of unusual sensitivity to morphine. Some individuals could respond severely to quantities that others tolerated. The state answered that Helen had previously received morphine without showing such an extraordinary sensitivity. The autopsy also showed no disease of the kidneys, and the attending physicians returned repeatedly to the same combination of symptoms: the early sense of pleasant exhilaration, the progressive coma, the tiny symmetrical pupils, and the exceptionally slow breathing. Dr. Fowler was emphatic. In his experience, the complete picture was consistent with opiate poisoning and little else. The scientific testimony became so technical and exhausting that William Travers Jerome at one point became overwhelmed in court, and proceedings had to be adjourned. Arguments between the lawyers became heated. Medical experts contradicted one another, and the courtroom itself turned into something approaching a public attraction. Newspapers reported large numbers of fashionable spectators attending the proceedings. One young woman even presented Harris with flowers. The New York Times criticized the spectacle, arguing that a man on trial for his life should not be treated as entertainment. But beneath the spectacle were several pieces of testimony the jury had to confront. Harris had strongly resisted public acknowledgement of Helen as his wife. He had made troubling remarks about the consequences if the marriage became known. Mrs. Potts gave him a deadline. Within roughly a day of receiving that demand, he obtained the morphine and quinine prescription. He kept the capsules overnight. He gave Helen 4 and retained 2. He encouraged her to continue taking them when she complained that they made her feel worse. After her death, he claimed to have checked immediately with the pharmacist when evidence showed that he had not. He initially described Helen merely as a friend, and according to testimony later summarized by the Court of Appeals, Harris told another physician that no jury would convict him because he possessed 2 capsules that could be analyzed and shown to contain the correct dose. For the prosecution, that statement went directly to the design of the alleged plan. Those 2 surviving capsules were not simply leftover medicine. They were insurance. On February 8, 1892, exactly 2 years after the secret marriage, the case went to the jury. The jurors deliberated for approximately 80 minutes. Their verdict was guilty of murder in the first degree. Carlyle Harris was sentenced to death by electrocution. His mother refused to accept it. Frances Macready. Harris was herself a writer and lecturer who used the name Hope Ledyard. She became one of her son's most determined defenders. William F. Howe, one of New York's best-known criminal lawyers, was brought into the case during the appeal. The argument now focused strongly on the weakness Harris's supporters believed had existed from the beginning. Everything depended on inference. There was no eyewitness. There was no surviving poisoned capsule. There was no direct evidence showing Harris placing additional morphine into anything. Could a man's life legally be taken on a chain of circumstances? In January 1893, the New York Court of Appeals answered yes. The judges unanimously affirmed the conviction. Judge John Gray acknowledged that the evidence connecting Harris directly to the alleged act was entirely circumstantial. But circumstantial evidence, he explained, was not automatically inferior to eyewitness testimony. If established facts collectively pointed toward one reasonable conclusion while excluding the alternatives, a jury was entitled to convict. After an exceptionally detailed review of the case, the court concluded that the chain against Harris was sufficient. The fight was still not over. Harris's supporters produced new affidavits claiming Helen had used morphine herself. If true, that could radically change the case. Recorder Smith examined the new material in March 1893 and refused to grant another trial. He considered portions of the supposed new evidence unreliable and described some of it in extremely strong terms. Meanwhile, Frances Harris organized a campaign to save her son. Approximately 60,000 signatures were gathered. Governor Roswell P. Flower ordered an additional review. Nothing changed the result. The execution remained scheduled for May 8, 1893. At Sing Sing prison that morning, Carlyle Harris continued to insist that he had not killed Helen. Outside the prison, a large crowd waited for the signal announcing that the sentence had been carried out. Electrocution was still relatively new, as a method of capital punishment in New York. Only a few years had passed since the state had first adopted it. Harris was 24 years old. Before his death, he acknowledged that parts of his personal life had been immoral and said he hoped his fate might serve as a warning to other young men. But on the central accusation, he did not yield. He said he died absolutely innocent of the crime. On May 8, 1893, the sentence was carried out. His mother maintained the same position after his death. Accounts of the case record that she publicly described what had happened to her son as a judicial killing. The memorial associated with Harris would later carry words expressing the belief that 12 jurors had condemned an innocent man. For Francis Harris, the verdict never became the truth. More than a century later, however, the strongest way to examine this case is not to begin with Harris's guilt or innocence. It is to return to what can actually be established. Helen Potts was 19 years old. She was healthy enough on January 31st to walk with her mother and Harris and spend part of the evening reading and talking. She had taken 3 capsules from the prescription without experiencing anything resembling the final reaction. She almost discarded the 4th. After swallowing it, she developed a pattern of symptoms that several experienced physicians diagnosed as profound opiate poisoning. Morphine was later detected in her body. Her heart and kidneys showed no disease capable of easily explaining her sudden collapse. The prescription had been prepared carefully at the pharmacy. The 2 capsules retained by Harris contained the correct quantity. Harris had possessed all 6 capsules privately before giving 4 to Helen, and the dangerous capsule, if there was one, was the only capsule that could never be tested. Those facts do not show the moment when the medicine was altered. There is no photograph of it, no confession, and no witness standing beside Harris when it happened. That is why the case mattered so much legally. The jury was asked to decide whether a series of individually incomplete facts could form one complete conclusion. They decided that it could. New York's highest court agreed. There is also one final detail worth considering. Had the altered capsule, assuming the prosecution was correct, been one of the first 3 Helen swallowed, Harris would have been away from New York in Virginia when she became seriously ill. The remaining capsules would have appeared ordinary. And had Helen taken the final capsule while completely alone and simply remained asleep, there might have been no roommates to hear her speaking about unusual dreams, numbness, and difficulty swallowing. There might have been no physicians watching the progression of her symptoms hour by hour. Instead, the last capsule remained until January 31st. Her roommates returned during the short period when Helen could still speak. Doctors reached her while the effects were unfolding, and an empty medicine box bearing the initials of a medical student remained inside the room. The Court of Appeals itself recognized the unusual way those circumstances had frustrated what prosecutors believed was a carefully concealed crime. The case of Helen Potts was never resolved by one dramatic discovery. It was built by accumulation, a secret marriage, a promise repeatedly postponed, a mother's deadline, a prescription written almost immediately afterward, 6 capsules from a pharmacy, 4 given to Helen, 2 retained, 3 taken without fatal effect, and 1 final capsule that could never be examined. Helen Potts almost threw that capsule away. Instead, trusting the people around her, she swallowed it. Less than a day later, she was dead. And from that small medicine box emerged one of the most closely argued circumstantial murder cases of Gilded Age New York, a case in which no one ever saw the alleged crime committed, yet 12 jurors became convinced that the answer had been hidden among 6 ordinary-looking capsules.